In this video, we will be reassembling the Kawasaki FX921V engine. To begin, we will be installing the crankshaft, but we first want to apply a small amount of oil on the point at which the crankshaft meets the engine. And as we install this, we do want to pay very close attention to our oil pump gear in relation to where it meets the gear on the crankshaft so that these mesh together properly. And we will move on to cylinder 2 side of the engine for our piston installation, beginning with removal of the connecting rod end cap. If we take a close look at the raised portion of the end cap, if we flip that over, that raised portion does not line up properly. So we want to make sure we are installing this correctly. Now it is worth noting on the crown of the piston we do have an arrow indicator. That arrow needs to be pointing towards the K mark on the side of the connecting rod. Before installation, we will apply just a little bit of oil to the piston skirt, as well as the inside of the cylinder. And as we set this up for installation, we want that arrow indicator pointing towards the flywheel end of the crankshaft, or that flywheel journal. We can then install our piston ring compressor, making sure we compress all 3 piston rings. Verify that we aren't going to collide with the crank pin on the crankshaft by rotating that around slightly, and then install that piston. Before we mesh these components together, we will apply a little bit of oil to the connecting rod as well as the crank pin journal on the crankshaft. And a little oil on that end cap before we assemble that together. And we want to start those end cap bolts by hand. We want to be able to screw them in at least 10 turns before we put a tool on it. We can then snug these 10mm bolts. We are then going to under torque these to 120 inch-pounds. This is below the manufacturer specification for this particular engine. And at this point I like to cycle the engine a couple times just to make sure everything feels good. So far so good. With our piston on cylinder side 2 installed, we will shift our attention to cylinder side 1. And we can remove our end cap. And on that end cap, we also have a raised portion that needs to match in shape. We also have an arrow indicator on the crown of the piston. And this arrow indicator needs to point to the opposite side of the connecting rod that has that K indicator mark. So again, we have our K indicator mark on one side, and the arrow ends up facing away from that K indicator mark. And a little bit of oil on the piston skirt, as well as the cylinder walls. We can then set that piston in place. And we want that arrow indicator facing the flywheel side of the engine, or the flywheel journal on our crankshaft. And I am again going to rotate the crankshaft just to reduce any chance that my connecting rod will collide with any of these components. And we can then install our ring compressor and push that piston in place. Inside the engine, I'm going to oil the connecting rod. I'm going to oil the crank pin journal on the crankshaft, as well as the connecting rod end cap. That end cap can then be positioned in place, making sure to line up the raised portion. And we are going to, again, start those end cap bolts by hand, about 10 turns. Snug those down. And then torque those to 120 inch-pounds. Now again, we are under torquing these based on what the manufacturer says we should torque these to. And we will do another check to see if the engine still rotates freely. And we are looking good. We can then apply a little bit of oil to the shank of the tappets, and we can install those above our crankshaft location. And we also want to apply a little bit of oil to our camshaft journal as well as the camshaft lobes. And if we take a look at the timing gear on the crankshaft, we want to locate the small punch mark on one of the teeth. That is our timing mark that we will need to sync up with our cam gear. And that cam gear also has a punch mark or timing mark. So as we install the cam gear, we need to rotate the engine so those marks align. And to prep for installation of our side cover, we will apply a little bit of oil to the cam gear journal as well as the magneto journal on the crankshaft. And we can slip that side cover on. And we do want to verify that it has sealed properly. Now typically you would replace the gasket material. We are not doing it in this video. Each of the 11 bolts get started by hand, and then using a 14mm socket on an extension, we're going to very gently start all of these bolts by hand again, putting them in about 8 to 10 turns. And then we're going to go around again and snug them down just by hand, only using the socket with extension. And then lastly, we will snug these bolts in sequence. However, we are not torquing them to the manufacturer specified torque setting. Our next objective is to build our cylinder head for cylinder side number 1. We need to identify our parts. We have 3 valves, 6 keepers, 3 retainers, and 3 springs. We can identify the exhaust valve because it is larger than the 2 intake valves. Our 2 keepers for the exhaust side are also just slightly larger than our 4 keepers for the intake side. Our retainers have a noticeable size difference as well. The exhaust side is larger, while the intake side 2 retainers are smaller. And our springs as well follow the same pattern. Our 1 exhaust spring is larger than the 2 intake springs, this being the diameter of the springs. We can begin by flipping up our cylinder head, and we want to apply a little bit of oil to the valve stems. And then we can install those in place, making sure the larger exhaust valve is in the larger exhaust port. We first want to install the keepers into our retainer, and then we can set that assembly on the valve stem, and then using whatever tool or method you prefer, we want to depress the spring so those valve keepers slide into place. Now there are a wide variety of tools available for this procedure. And with those valves installed, we can then install our rocker arm for the intake side, followed by the exhaust side. We can then install our head gasket on cylinder side number 1. Prior to installing the head, we are going to cycle the engine so that the piston is at top dead center. And then we can install that cylinder head and start one bolt by hand, followed by the remaining bolts. And we can snug those with a 14mm socket on an extension by hand. And we're going to tighten those in sequence according to the manufacturer specifications. Now these should be torqued, but for the purpose of this video, we will not be torquing them. I had previously installed my rocker arms temporarily. We can remove the intake side and install our short push rod and reinstall the rocker arm. And if you happen to have pressure on that rocker arm, we can rotate the crankshaft slightly to reduce that pressure. We can follow that same procedure with our exhaust side. And snug that bolt down. And if we cycle the engine again, we should be able to see those rocker arms move. And with that complete, we can install our rocker cover gasket, followed by our rocker cover. And this is held on by 4 10mm bolts that we want to start by hand. And although this should be torqued for the purpose of this video, we are just going to snug these bolts. Taking a look at our components for cylinder head number 2, we have our gasket, our cylinder head, and our valve components. And again, our exhaust side valve components are slightly larger than the intake side. And don't forget to put a little bit of oil on the valve stem. And we will temporarily install those rocker arms also. And we'll cycle that engine and bring that piston up to top dead center, which will then be followed by our gasket and our cylinder head. Starting a bolt by hand will prevent that from falling off. And we can add the rest of those bolts. And we will be tightening those down with a ratchet in sequence. And similar to the other side of the engine, we will remove the rocker arm, install our push rod, and reinstall the rocker arm if we do need to rotate that crankshaft a little bit to release any tension on that. That might be beneficial. That shorter push rod does go for the intake. And rotating the crankshaft should articulate those valves. After that, we have our rocker cover with gasket. And we can snug those down by hand and then come back with a ratchet. With our cylinders complete, we can move on to the flywheel, and we can begin by installing the flywheel key, followed by the flywheel, making sure we line up that keyway. After that, we have our flywheel fan, our spacer, and our base plate. And when we install the base plate, we want to ensure that the 4 protrusions are lined up. However, we also have 4 holes that need to be lined up so we can install our threaded studs. And then those threaded studs can be installed. And those will be snugged with a 10mm socket. And we're ready for our flywheel bolt. Next we have the intake manifold, this being held on by 6 10mm bolts. And we're going to snug those bolts. We then have our carburetor insulator, followed by the carburetor and governor arm. And we can snug that pinch bolt. We then have our control panel, and we do want to attach the spring first. And then our pipe intake. We can add those 2 nuts, as well as the 2 bolts. And we can snug those down. And don't forget that air line underneath, as well as our wiring harness. We can then do our cylinder 1 side ignition coil. And we want that set to 10 thousandths on both sides. And we can connect our wiring harness. That same procedure can be applied to our ignition coil for the other side. And our wiring harness. We're going to wait on our spark plugs so we can do a compression test at the end, but we can go ahead and install the oil filter. And before we forget, we do have a ground wire we need to install. We then have our shroud. We want to attempt to work around cylinder side number 1. You want to be gentle when you do this so that you do not bend the shroud. And we can install 5 10mm bolts to hold that shroud in place. And we'll snug those with our T-handle wrench. And we want to feed our wires through and clip them in place. We can then install the shroud on cylinder side number 2, also held on by 5 10mm bolts. And again, you do want to be careful not to bend the shroud. And we will snug those down with a 10mm socket. We can then install our starter. This has 2 12mm bolts, followed by our fan housing. Now we do want to route those spark plug wires out of the way of that fan housing. And that is held on by 3 10mm screws. There's one at the back of the engine near the oil dipstick. There's one to the right of the carburetor, and there is one just near the starter. We then have our screen for the top with 4 T30 Torx fasteners. We'll hook up our oil cooler next. Held on by 2 10mm fasteners. Our voltage regulator has two T25 fasteners. And we will hook up that ground wire as well as our harness. Next comes our fuel pump next to the carburetor with our fuel line. We have our plastic guard held on by three 10mm fasteners. We have our bracket with one 12mm nut and two 10mm bolts. Followed by our air tube and our air filter housing. And the other half of that bracket. We have our secondary filter and our primary filter and our cover. And lastly, our rain cap. And that concludes our assembly of the Kawasaki FX921V engine.